When Russia invaded Ukraine over 3 years ago, people thought their days were numbered. Within just a few weeks, their currency had lost almost 30% of its value, and inflation had surged to 18%. Everyone was convinced their feeble economy was on the brink of collapse. But 3 years later, Russia is still standing and honestly, seemingly stronger than ever. Their economy has grown by nearly 20%, far outpacing the rest of Europe, and even its inflation rate has stabilized at 7%. But, if you dig just beneath the surface, another story emerges. While at a glance, Russia may seem like it's thriving, this isn't real growth. It's really a sugar high fueled by borrowed cash, war spending, and oil profits. And beneath the surface, Russia is quietly unraveling, slowly but surely. Behind the numbers is a country burning through its future, with enlistment bonuses hitting $29,000, industries begging for workers, and a population that's slowly vanishing. Russia has kept going against all the odds. But is this a story of resilience, or are we just watching the slow collapse in disguise? Either way, one thing is clear. The real reason Russia's economy hasn't collapsed might be the same reason it eventually does. Most countries can either be termed as developed economies or developing ones. But then there's Russia. It has the second highest rate of university-level education in the world, one of the strongest militaries, and the second largest nuclear arsenal. Yet much of its economy still functions like a resource-dependent developing country. A quarter of the country's workforce is employed in heavy industry, things like mining, quarrying, and oil extraction. And the average income is just under $14,000 a year, which is about a third of the EU average. So, to understand how Russia has managed to survive, and even thrive under crushing sanctions, we need to first go back to an earlier version of the country, the 1990s and the collapse of the Soviet Union. The country was in the midst of a crisis. By 1992, inflation had spiked 2,250%. That means every year, prices were expected to increase by 225 times. Living in Russia was practically impossible. People had to carry stacks of cash just to buy a loaf of bread. And there were even reports of people burning rubles just to heat their homes, since it was cheaper than buying firewood. As a result, life expectancy had tanked, falling from 64 to 57 in just 4 years. But, amidst all the chaos, the country had one unique lifeline, which would go on to save it from total collapse: oil. Russia sits on the largest natural gas reserves in the world. But during the Soviet era, these were barely used simply because there was no one to export to. Europe, wary of dependence on a rival power, blocked most trade, and only 3% of their oil came from the USSR. And of course, the US completely refused to trade with its arch-rival. But when the Soviet Union collapsed, all of this changed. For a time, the West believed that it was inevitable that Russia would become an open capitalist democracy, and they welcomed the country into their trade networks with open arms. At the start of the 90s, Russian revenues from oil exports were sitting at around 90 billion, by no means a small amount. But by 2008, this number had increased to over 600 billion, a quarter of the country's GDP. Thanks to all this revenue, the country was able to modernize its military, pay off its debts, and reassert itself as a geopolitical force. By 2019, fossil fuel exports made up nearly 60% of Russia's total export revenue, and oil and gas accounted for around 30% of government income. Oil had made the country extremely rich, but, it came at a price. Because oil was so profitable, the government and the country's oligarchs had little incentive to invest in anything else. Manufacturing, technology, consumer goods, basically, all the sectors that typically make a modern economy were neglected. Entire regions of the country became economically dependent on energy exports. Routine oil price fluctuations could make communities rich or, honestly, push them to the brink of poverty. Of course, this isn't an entirely unique story. From Venezuela to Angola, many countries have found themselves trapped in a cycle of oil dependency. And, well, they always ended badly. But here's the thing. It seemed like Russia was different. The country's dependence on oil might actually be its biggest strength. When Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, many analysts predicted that the wave of Western sanctions, cutting off banks, freezing assets, and halting trade, would bring the Russian economy to its knees. For most countries, it would have been a death sentence. But that collapse never came. And that's because Russia had something that everybody wanted: cheap energy. No matter how hard the West tried, the global demand for energy didn't disappear. Following the invasion, Europe and the US slowly cut down the amount of Russian oil they were buying. But at the same time, India and China were slowly buying up the stock. The result, Russian oil revenues have remained totally stable despite all the sanctions. And remember, oil is by far the most important sector in the Russian economy. As of 2024, this sector alone accounted for 30% of government revenue and almost 20% of the GDP. The truth about Russia's economy depends entirely on who's telling the story. The Kremlin paints a picture of resilience, while Western outlets claim it's all smoke and mirrors. It's hard to know what's what, and that's why I use Ground News. It's the only platform I found that actually shows you how different outlets report on the same story side by side. Whether it's a left-leaning source, a right one, or somewhere in the middle, Ground News lets you compare headlines directly so you can spot the bias, blind spots, and the spin. Take this story about Germany giving long-range weapons to Ukraine. A right-leaning outlet frames it as M starting the beginning of World War II, whereas a left-leaning one simply says that missile limits have been lifted. Without knowing the agendas behind these stories, it's easy to get misled. I also use their blind spot feature every day, which shows you stories being ignored by certain parts of the media, so you're not just reading what one side wants you to hear. Even though Russia depends heavily on oil, the fact is Russia doesn't need a strong tech sector to keep the lights on. It doesn't need to produce smartphones or run a global car industry. As long as the oil keeps pumping and there are buyers willing to take it, money will keep coming in and the Russian economy stays afloat. 2 years after full sanctions, the country should be in ruins. Instead, it has experienced a faster rate of economic growth than the UK, Germany, and even the US. So, has Russia actually found a way to thrive despite the sanctions, isolation, and full-scale war on its doorstep? Well, not exactly. Here's the thing. Exporting billions of dollars worth of oil is good for two things: stabilizing the economy and buying the country time. If it wasn't for all the oil, Russia would have long been bankrupt. But the reality is, Russia can't rely on oil forever. To become a real player on the international stage, it would need to diversify its industries, providing more than just energy. This means government investment in strategic sectors like infrastructure projects and structural reform. But this simply hasn't happened. Instead, the Kremlin has focused on one thing: turning the Russian economy into a war machine. The amount of money being spent on the military has steadily been rising, peaking at 6% of the country's GDP, almost double the US's at 3.4%. 4%. And some estimates are even suggesting that up to 35% of the government's current budget is spent on the military. This shift in focus from economic diversification to militarization hasn't just reshaped budgets. It's reshaped the very incentives that are facing Russian workers. The Kremlin has begun offering eye-watering bonuses just to keep soldiers signing up. In some regions, new recruits are being paid as much as $29,000 just to enlist. To put that into perspective, that's more than double the average Russian salary. And these aren't just isolated payouts. Federal spending on enlistment bonuses alone is estimated to cost the government $16 to $23 billion every year. Now, you might be thinking, surely this will ruin the country. After all, huge spending on military capacity means less money going to education, infrastructure, and research and development, the things that actually grow an economy. But here's the thing, rather than harming growth, the Russian war machine might actually be the thing that has kept the economy running, at least for now. But that growth comes at a cost, one that doesn't show up in GDP figures. In some regions, hospitals are dangerously understaffed. Thousands of medical workers have either been sent to the front lines or left the profession entirely, forcing midwives and paramedics to take on doctors' duties. Schools are struggling too, with more teachers are quitting than being replaced, and budgets are shifting from classrooms to patriotic education and war-related programs. Meanwhile, the country's young men are disappearing. The most recent military draft pulled over 160,000 men aged 18 to 30 from towns, jobs, and universities, while others are absorbed into defense factories, creating labor shortages across civilian life. And for those left behind, life is getting harder. Inflation may officially sit at 10%, but essentials like eggs and sugar have doubled in price, and rents in cities like Moscow are squeezing middle-class families. For everyday Russians, this isn't resilience, it's survival, and it's growing more fragile by the day. This all comes down to a strange phenomenon called war economics. The idea is simple. When a country gears its economy toward war, the government becomes the main customer, pumping money into factories, infrastructure, and jobs tied to defense. This surge in spending stimulates production, reducing unemployment, and temporarily boosting GDP, even if it's not creating long-term value. And this is exactly what's happening in Russia. Their economy has reportedly grown by 13% since the start of the war, almost 3 times as fast as the EU average. But there is a problem with this. While GDP might be going up, there's no real value in what is being created. So the second the government runs out of money to spend, the entire system comes crashing down. And that might be happening sooner than anybody expected. Russia is currently burning through cash at a staggering pace. The country's national wealth fund's liquid assets are down to just $31 billion, the lowest level since the 2008 crisis, with projections estimating that as soon as by this autumn, the country could run out of reserves. No one knows exactly what would happen next. But one thing is clear, the economy is more dependent than ever on military spending, and if the money runs out, the whole system could collapse. To make matters worse, there's another risk that comes with excessive war spending, one which might be eating the country from within. Inflation. Officially, Russia's inflation rate is around 7%, which is high but not catastrophic. But with that said, many economists are skeptical, and with good reason. Here's the thing. Russia's central bank has had to raise interest rates multiple times in the past year. As of early 2024, the key interest rate was sitting at 16%. That's one of the highest rates in the world, higher than Brazil, Turkey, or Argentina. And that raises a serious question. If inflation is really just 7%, why are interest rates more than double that? The answer is simple. The official numbers might not be telling the full story. Take a look at this graph. It shows the US inflation rate and interest rates over time. If you notice anything, you'll see that when inflation is high, so are interest rates. And that's because in any normal economy, ultra-IGH interest rates are used to fight inflation. Central banks only go that high when prices are spiraling out of control and they need to cool the economy down fast. So either the Bank of Russia is being wildly overcautious or inflation is actually much worse than they're letting on to. Some people have reported rent doubling in less than a year and basic food items like eggs and sugar regularly selling for double their price. Independent economists have also suggested that real inflation in Russia could be anywhere from 15 to 20%, double the reported figures. What you need to keep in mind is that if the Kremlin is lying about inflation figures, what's to say they aren't telling the truth about GDP, unemployment, or even their cash reserves? At a time when the West is looking to crush a long-standing rival, it makes perfect sense for them to inflate their figures. And after all, Russia doesn't exactly have the best reputation of honesty. GDP growth, unemployment rates, foreign investment numbers, these are all metrics reported by the same government that tightly controls its media, censors dissent, and imprisons critics. In a country where political survival often depends on projecting strength, the temptation to fiddle with the numbers is enormous. The Kremlin claims to have enough reserves to keep the economy afloat. But if they're willing to understate inflation, why wouldn't they overstate what's left in the National Wealth Fund? After all, confidence is the main thing keeping it going. And when this collapses, the currency collapse usually follows. In the end, the problem is this. In a closed system where data is political and accountability is almost non-existent, there's no way to know how much of Russia's reported success is real and how much is just lies. So, where does that leave us? On paper, Russia's economy looks like it's defying the odds. Growing while under sanctions, fielding a powerful military, and keeping the lights on despite global isolation. But look closer, and the cracks do begin to show. Runaway spending, a shrinking labor force, and possibly hidden inflation. All for an economy propped up by oil and war. This isn't a story of long-term resilience. It's a high-wire act. Russia has bought itself time, but it hasn't used that time to build a future. And sooner rather than later, the bill will come due. Because you can't borrow forever, and you can't fake the numbers forever, and you definitely can't build a stable economy in times of